Hey, folks, can everybody hear me out there?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. How is everybody today?
Hey, it's sunny outside.
That's
Can't
hey,
complain.
that's a start. You're absolutely right. Gonna wait just a moment, see who else might come on. Okay, it's 3:03, so I'm gonna get started. So quick question for you. The email that went out in regards to this class was for residential sales contract updates, not residential sales contract. So you guys tell me what you want me to do. Do you want me to go through the sales contract itself? Do you want me to just go through the updates and then maybe cover buyer rep docs and or listing agreement? You tell me what you want me to do.
I'm interested in the changes.
Okay,
Yes, I agree. If we can go over some of the changes and kind of even if we could go over just kind of like the contract as a whole, but mostly like the changes.
okay. When you say go over the contract as a whole, what does that mean?
Kind of just like if we can I guess if you're going over whatever like the changes are in the contracts, kind of going over like the sections of the changes as well.
Okay, there wasn't, and the reason why I asked that because the new contract, the new sales contract was updated in July of last year. And there hasn't been a new one since then. There have been some new documents that have come out, but we haven't done, there hasn't been a whole lot of changes on it. And I'll definitely go through those with you, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity. If and those changes, it won't take us very long, and that's why I offered we could go through if you're if you wanted to go through the buyer agreement and or the listing agreement, would certainly be willing to do that as well. So we'll jump into the contract here, and then what we'll do is we'll talk about what else we might want to talk about. So I'm gonna let's see here. I'm going to share my screen. And let's see, I want. Can everybody see my screen?
I cannot.
You cannot. Okay, let me.
No.
Okay. Roberto, I see your screen up on mine. Let's see here.
I still see the tiles with everybody's name.
Yeah, I do too. I'm having problems bringing this up.
Oh, there it comes.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, can everybody, so everybody can see this, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so the changes really referred to in this particular case was really the financing piece, okay, in here. And it really came down to if it was a full cash deal, then that sale price would be, that would be the entire cash would go in here, and there wouldn't be any financing. There would just be that would just be the entire amount. There wouldn't be, and then it would be a down payment, okay? But there wouldn't be any financing or anything else like that. Before, you used to have, and in here you would just check other and put in cash. But otherwise, this pretty much has stayed the same. The down payment is going to be either in a dollar amount and or percent, whatever is easier for you and easier for you to calculate. And then if there is going to be financing, that's going to be the dollar amount that's going to be financed, the loan amount itself, and that's the total sales price minus the down payment. And then that's going to be the loan amount itself. And then down here, it will fill in automatically the total financing itself. So if I put in a 20% down payment here and I put in 80% financing, you're going to see this populate to 100%. And does everybody know what I'll just go over a couple of quick things here. Does everybody know what a financing contingency is? As far as when it comes to, I'm sorry, not finance, but a seller subsidy. I was a little bit ahead of myself here. Does everybody know what a seller subsidy is?
Yes, isn't that what the sellers will be like closing costs, what they would be covering?
Yes, seller subsidy basically is a sort of a deal sweetener, if you will, from the seller. And the seller, sometimes the buyer needs some additional monies for closing costs. Okay, and a seller can provide some relief and in the way of a subsidy. In a VA loan, it can only be up to 3%, and typically it's it's the closing costs. The subsidy itself is determined. It goes towards closing costs, but the lender is the one that determines what it goes towards in the closing cost category. The buyer doesn't get to determine that. The seller doesn't get to determine that. It's the lender that determines that. But the finance contingency hasn't changed much. That's pretty much the same. The appraisal contingency really has not changed that much. They did add this sentence about seller will or will not provide access to reasonable access for appraisal purposes. Well, if it's not contingent on it, they don't necessarily have to provide reasonable access for appraisal purposes. And that really is sort of a key to this whole thing. If it's not, the seller does not have to provide it. So what happens is we are waiving sometimes the appraisal contingency as part of the terms of the contract. But if it's a loan, there's going to be an appraisal that has to go with it, even though you waived it. I might say, I'll give you $500,000 for this home, and I'm going to waive the appraisal on it. But the problem is, if I'm the buyer and I go to get a loan, I'm going to have to get an appraisal. It won't have anything to do with the terms of the contract, but down here, you're going to have to check will or will not. So if I waive it, it's not contingent, and I said will not provide access, that could be a point of contention, because obviously the seller has no obligation at that point in time to allow you and or an appraiser to get into the house for the appraisal. That's a problem. Okay, so if it's not contingent, but you're still going to get a loan, okay, cash transactions are not really going to require an appraisal unless somebody wants to do it on their own and it has nothing to do with the contract. But if it's not going to be contingent on an appraisal, and there is going to be a loan, which almost every single loan is going to require an appraisal, then you're going to check will, okay? Because then that gives you the opportunity in your client to get in and do the appraisal itself. Buyer representations, that really hasn't changed. I will talk a little bit about this just for a second, even though it hasn't changed. the buyer will or will not occupy the property. The reason, one of the major reasons for this is for fraud, mortgage fraud. And number one, that's the number one reason. The second reason is investment property. If they're not going to live there and it's going to be an investment property, the qualifications for a loan on this property is going to be a little bit different. The down payment's usually going to be a little bit higher, typically around 25% for an investment property. And then there's going to be some additional qualifying information that might be required: higher debt to income ratio, high credit score, those kinds of things. Deposit hasn't changed, settlement hasn't changed. Virginia, you get to pick the settlement company. So none of that's changed. I do want to talk about delivery for a minute. Even though this hasn't changed, this still tends to be a little bit of a problem. Is everybody still with me out there?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
I'm
good.
here.
Okay, thanks. So the delivery part of this is, it's how you intend to communicate with the other party in regards to the delivery of documents, conversations, those kinds of things. And it's really important that you make sure that you are providing enough access to everybody in order to make sure that this thing works fine. So you see number A, you obviously, this is a sales contract, so you're representing the buyer. So it says address to the seller at property address. You will always check email, and you will always put in the other agent's email address automatically. Okay, the listing agent's email address will go here. Now, if they want to change it or add something to it later on, they can do that. Okay, but then that would have to be initialed by your buyer and the seller. B, addressed to the buyer, and this is key. I know this is a little bit of a personal preference, but it does tend to be an issue. A lot of agents feel like they don't want they want everything to come to them and not necessarily their buyers. They don't want them to get, a home inspection report that is, negative or whatever it might be. And so they put their email address in there. Okay, so if I don't put anybody else's email address in there, any documentation that is provided in the transaction itself will only go to me. What if you're out of the country? What if something happens that you can't get to it and you miss a deadline? You now put your buyer in a very precarious and probably a bad position. So personally, I always put my name in there and the buyer's names. That way, we all get a chance to look at it. And I will just caveat that by saying that if the conversations that you have with your buyers and or your sellers at the beginning of any transaction is key. Lay out the requirements, lay out the expectations of them and of you, and let them know, something, you don't get bent out of shape about this. Don't worry about that. It'll all come to us. We'll talk through it and we'll work through it. It's a collaborative effort in my mind. And if your buyer isn't mature enough, or you're afraid that they're going to react in a negative manner, maybe the expectations you set need to be a little bit stronger. But if you, and I'll give you a perfect example, if you have a home inspection and that deadline is a certain time, and you are the only one that is supposed to receive that, and you missed that deadline, and your buyer never had a chance to look at it, and now the contract, because you missed the deadline, you can't get anything fixed. The seller has no obligation now. Your buyer is going to be pretty upset with you. So just something to keep in mind. Residential Property Act. And again, this is the same thing. This is for of the residential property HOA documents. Who's it going to go to? And again, I do put in both myself and the buyer's name. Same with condominium, same thing. property maintenance hasn't changed, contract is contingent or waives the home inspection itself. And if you're going to waive any contingency, whether it be the home inspection, whether it be appraisal, whether it be radon, whatever it might be, any contingency at all, then what we're asking you to do is to provide another form to your client that it's called the adverse possession form disclosure. Adverse conditions disclosure. I got adverse possession on my mind from this morning. Adverse conditions. And basically what this is, it doesn't say, it will tell you at the top of that document that it doesn't have any effect on the contract. But what typically happens in the conversation between a agent and a client, whether it be a seller or whether it be a buyer, in this particular case, it's the buyer, is that you go through, and if you're going to, waive one of the contingencies, it's usually sort of, I'm not going to say glossed over, but there's a very short conversation about it. Yes, we'll waive the home inspection. That happens all the time in this market. We see it. It's very commonplace. Well, that doesn't give them any idea of what the repercussions might be. The adverse conditions document basically says, you need to be aware that, waiving this particular contingency might have consequences on it that you want to examine. And all it does is literally give you an opportunity to have a more in-depth conversation with your client in regards to what the repercussions are. And, if you know your stuff, which you should, you'll be able to have those conversations, and they're usually never a problem. So just something to keep in the top of your mind. Home inspection, they'll provide, the utilities hasn't changed. Personal property, one thing I do see all the time here is it's asking for a specific number. It's asking for you to check yes, and then the alarm system, how many are they going to get of each one of them? And the reason why we bring this up is because we had an agent that checked ceiling fan, yes, and didn't put anything in here. And then when they did the actual home inspection, there were 6 ceiling fans in the house. And then when at settlement, there was 1. They provided a ceiling fan. So put the quantities in there. Just one of those things to pay attention to. Leased items, that hasn't changed. Target lead-based paint housing hasn't changed. Does anybody want to explain to me how the lead-based paint disclosures work?
Is it any houses that were built on or before a certain year they would have lead-based paint, and you would have to disclose that? Was it 1989, I believe?
It's 1978.
1978.
Prior to 1978. So there's, and when you check that, whenever you have a property that is subject to the lead-based paint housing disclosures, okay, if you are the seller, there's 3 forms you need. If you are the buyer, you represent the buyer, there's 2 forms you need. In either case, the first form that both parties, regardless of what side you're on, need is the sales, the lead-based paint sales disclosure. And the second document that you would need, that only the seller signs, is the federal lead-based paint disclosure. And the seller will provide a lead-based paint pamphlet to the buyer. So the seller has to provide the sales lead-based paint disclosure and the federal lead-based paint disclosure. In that federal lead-based paint disclosure, which is literally an 8.5 by 14 document, page, inch document, that single space, it's got like 10,000 words on it. No one ever reads it. In the second paragraph, it specifically says that the seller will provide the buyer with a lead-based paint pamphlet. So the seller has to have 3 documents, and one of those documents, excuse me, 2 of those documents actually go over to the buyer. And that's the sales lead-based paint disclosure, and it's the pamphlet that goes over. The federal lead-based paint disclosure only stays with the seller. And so on the sales lead-based paint disclosure, about 3/4 of the way down that document, it's 1 page, there is a spot for you as the agent and the other agent, the listing agent, to initial and sign off on. And it basically says that I understand and have provided all of the necessary information for the on the form 42 USC blah blah blah. And that is where it tells you that you have to specifically provide the buyer with that pamphlet. And I will give you an example of what happened to us. We were at a closing table, settlement table, and it was in our office, and I was not the agent, but I was in the office, and I was the broker at the time. And we had a client that was doing a closing there, and the client was a $1 million property, above $1 million. And it was a $25,000 earnest money deposit. Literally at closing, the buyer got cold feet, and the buyer said, I can't go through with the transaction. I just can't do it. And the seller was, you can imagine, was pretty upset. They were all at the table at the same time. The seller was really upset and said, the agent said, well, you have no contingency. You just can't get out of the contract. And so the buyer said, I can't go through with it. It doesn't feel right. I'm not going to go through with it. Well, the buyer, at that point in time, the seller and the seller's agent said, which was our agent, said, well, we're just going to keep the EMD then. We're just going to keep the 25,000. It's not right that you're doing this at the last moment. Well, the buyer left. A few days later, we get a letter from a lawyer, real estate attorney, that says, show me where you actually provided the lead-based paint pamphlet to the buyer. And we didn't, because no one paid attention to it. The seller had to give back the $25,000, and they were not happy. So that pamphlet is key. You have to provide that to your buyer. The seller is supposed to do that, but we also encourage you, if you represent the buyer, we also encourage you to provide it to the buyer, simply because it's good business. Wouldn't you want your client to be able to, wouldn't you be concerned about, children in the house when there's lead-based paint involved? Of course you would. So it's just good business too. Okay, home warranties. It hasn't changed that much. It's got a little bit more specific as to, the dollar amounts and who's going to provide it, that kind of stuff, but it's pretty much stayed the same. Wood destroying insects have changed a little bit. In this particular case, in the past, a VA loan, the seller had to pay for the home inspection. The seller is always responsible for the remediation of any damage by wood destroying insects. The seller always has to fix it. But in the past, for a VA loan only, the seller had to pay for it. But that's no longer the case. The VA has waived that and said, okay, it's negotiable. So when you're doing this, if I represent the buyer, which is, again, this is a sales contract, what I like to do is I like to have the buyer pay for it, my buyer, and it's simply because I get to control it. I don't want the seller calling their cousin Vinny over to do the home to do the wood inspection. So I do, I typically do that, but that's up to you. And then none, there are some lenders that don't require a wood destroying insect inspection. B and B, I think, B and B doesn't require it. And there's a couple of others. And anything in a condo that's above the third floor is not required. Let's see what else here. Real estate license. Yeah.
Is there is there any way to cap the liability or cost that a seller would have to pay should there be some, wood destroying pests involved? I had a seller once say it's open-ended. They were really uncomfortable with that. And I said, well, it's just kind of how it works. You understand? Like, let's say
Yeah.
they find termite damage and it's extensive, and it could be, a very large number. Is there any way to cap that, or is it?
That's a great question. The problem is this: it's a material defect, and you have to disclose it. So let's say that seller says, I don't want to fix it because it could cost me a lot of money. They're going to have a real difficult time selling that house, because now the agent has firsthand knowledge that it is a material defect. It will affect the decision that a buyer would make on a property. You can't withhold that. So if I have to tell you that if that falls through because the seller doesn't want to deal with it, and they try to sell a house, as the agent, I have to tell anybody that comes to that house and wants to make an offer that there is damage to the structure based on wood destroying insects. So there's not really a way to get around it. Now, can the seller say, I'll give you X amount of money to fix it as a credit? They could, but the question would be, and you have to be a little bit careful about this, the seller is the one. Let's say that you have a $400,000 property, and it usually happens on the lower end properties. Let's say you have a $400,000 property, and it's going to cost you $7,000 to fix the house, to fix the structure, and I'm going to give you $7,000. Well, the lender says, well, the house is, let's say it's going to cost $10,000. Has to be more. Let's say it's going to cost $10,000 to do the remediation on the insects. So the lender says, okay, $10,000. The closing costs on a $400,000 property is going to be, let's say, about 2%. You can go a little bit more, you can go a little bit less, but 2%. That's $8,000. But you're going to give me a credit for $10,000, but I can only spend $8,000 of it on closing costs because that's all there is. Guess who gets the extra $2,000?
Seller.
The seller. And the buyer is really unhappy because they thought they were getting 10 to fix the whole thing. So you got to be a little bit careful about that. But it is a material defect, and there's no getting around that. That's just not going to happen. Any other questions about that? Okay. I do want to talk a little bit about default for a moment, because I know this is something that everybody throws around and everybody gets, gets kind of bent out of shape. Your client's in default. We're going to sue you. We're going to keep your money. We're going to, we're going to burn your house down. We're going to steal your car. Everybody gets bent out of shape about this whole thing. And when you're in default, one of the parties has breached a term of the contract itself. And the only way that typically what people do will say, well, I'm going to keep your EMD. And everybody thinks that's automatically going to happen. That's not the way it works. So when somebody says to me, you're in default and we're going to keep your EMD, I'm like, okay, so what? Knock yourself out. Because if I'm representing the buyer and I'm in breach for whatever reason, okay, which never happens. But if it happened to be in breach and there is a dispute about the EMD, the only way that EMD can be dispensed is three ways. Number one, that both parties agree to the disposition of it. The buyer wants the money, the seller wants the money. There's not going to be any agreement there. That's off the table. Number two, number one is it goes to settlement. That's not going to happen because you're in default. Nobody wants to move forward. The second one is that the parties cannot come to a meeting of the minds as far as who's going to keep the money. The buyer wants it, the seller wants it. And the third is through court. That's the only way. So when somebody threatens you with EMD, I'm going to keep the EMD. Okay. Is that a situation that you want to be in? No. But is it something to get so crazy about that you rile your clients up about? No. You need to know the rules and know that for the most part, unless there's an egregious default on the part of the buyer, for the most part, that EMD is going to be contested. And a lot of times, and I can tell you that I see this, and this is my recommendation all the time, is that if there is a breach on the part of the buyer, they just don't want to go through with it, their financing fell through and it was the last minute, they changed financing, they did something that they shouldn't have done that was not in the initial terms of the contract itself, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to first, if I'm the buyers, I'm going to ask that the EMD come back to me, to the buyers, my clients. If there is a situation in which the buyers really did do something they shouldn't have done, and the seller is adamant on getting the EMD, I'm going to negotiate the EMD. I'm going to talk to the buyer and I'm going to say to the buyers, you know something, we really did harm this person. We kept the house off the market. Okay. They may have set up moving trucks and all this other kind of stuff, and they were harmed. And so that you can move on and they can move on, let's come to some sort of an agreement. And that way, for the most part, and we've seen this, I've seen this play out over and over and over again, where, they split the EMD, or depending on the size of the EMD, one party gets a third of it and the other party gets 2/3 of it, whatever it might be. But it's nothing to get bent out of shape about. It's just know that, when they say you're in default and we're keeping your EMD, it's something to be concerned about, but it's not something to lose your mind over. And I do see agents, to just really go off the deep end. Oh my God, what am I going to tell my buyers? Okay, you're going to tell them this. The other thing I really want to talk about real quick is voiding a contract and the release of the contract and the EMD. When you have a situation in which you have the right to void a contract, home inspection, appraisal, HOA docs, whatever it might be, and you have the right to void that contract, and you decide to write that void and send that over, it is a notice. It's called notice to void. Okay. And a notice is different than an addendum. A notice is the unilateral ability of one person in the party to be able to communicate a specific thing in the contract. They don't need a signature from the other side. The notice just says to void, says, hey, I'm voiding the contract based on this. And if you have the right to do that and you send that void over, the contract is now dead. It doesn't mean that it's ended and hasn't finished. It just means that no one is willing, that person is not willing to move forward on it. The second part of that is the release. And that's where the EMD comes in and where the contractual agreement comes in. So the notice of void just says, hey, I'm voiding based on this particular issue, home inspection, whatever it might be, whatever the reason might be. And in the notice to void, it actually asks you to state the reason. or the paragraph that that you're quoting that's allowing you to void. And then at the same time, when I send over the notice to void, I send over the release. The release has two pieces to it. The very first part is the earnest money. How is the disposition of the earnest money going to be adjudicated? How is that going to work? Who's going to get it? That kind of stuff. And the second part of it, and I think more important, is the release of the contractual agreements now and in the future. So even though I said I don't want to move forward based on, I'm voiding the contract based on this reason, but the contract has to end. It has to end. And how it ends is by that release. The release says, okay, if I sign off to release both parties, and that's an addendum that both parties have to sign off on. If I sign off on it, then I no longer have any obligations, and you can't come back at me at some point in time to do anything, sue me or whatever. Okay, so that's the biggest piece. To void and the release itself. That's really, there wasn't a ton of changes. Was there any questions that you guys had? No?
Isn't there something about appraisal gap coverage being added?
That's on the appraisal contingency. Yes, that's not in the contract though. And I think that's one of the things that that's the brand new one that happened. And they didn't update the contract. See, this is 722 down the bottom here. And you'll always, every January and every July, for the most part, pretty consistent, you'll see updates on the documents, and the date of the update will be down the bottom here. Okay, so the appraisal contingency did update, all of them, the conventional, the VA, the FHA, and those things did update. And the post-inspection, post settlement agreement also updated. So we could certainly go over that if that's something that you want to cover, because we still have time. Or we could go over the listing agreement and or the buyer agreement. What would you like to do?
Can we do buyer?
Sure. What does everybody else think?
Listing.
Okay. Anybody else?
I'm good with either.
You're good with
Yeah,
it?
honestly, either or is fine with me.
Okay. Let's see if I can. I got the buyer agreement up. Okay, this is going to be pretty simple. Okay, and in this particular instance, this is really, really simple. This is 5 pages. This really hasn't changed all that much. But again, the exclusive right to represent a buyer this is a document that a lot of agents, I shouldn't say a lot. I will say that there are agents out there that are afraid to basically bring this up when they're handling a new client. So for those of you that are newly licensed or fairly new in the business itself, you will be dealing with buyers. A significant portion of your business, the first year, 2 years of your real estate career, is going to be handling buyers. It's just a fact. And then at some point in time, you'll start working towards getting listing agreements and being able to really sort of call the shots at that point in time. But initially, it's going to be the buyer agreement. And so you really need to know, everything there is to know about so-called buyers, okay? The agreement itself, if you do not have an agreement, a written agreement, a buyer could turn around at some point in time during transactions and say, you don't represent me. Now, could there be an argument made that there's an implied agreement? Sure. Do you want to go to court? Do you want to try to fight that out? No, you really don't. It's not good for you. It's not good for the client. It doesn't make any sense. So I would tell you that it would be in your best interest all the time to have documents, have this document filled out and signed by both the party, but your client and the broker itself. And that way, this protects you and protects your ability to earn a commission based on a property that you might sell. Pretty simple. It's made on a specific date. It's buy in between. This is going to be the buyer, and then the broker is always going to be KW Metro Center. You're not the broker. It's KW Metro Center. Mailing address of the buyer. If you've got it, put it in there. Broker firm, that's going to be KW Metro Center, and the office that you're based out of could be KW Metro Center, 2111 Wilson Boulevard, 1701 Duke Street, whatever it might be. You're going to fill that in. And then your cell phone number, email address, and then when it's going to expire. Typically, it's 6 months. Sometimes it's a little bit shorter, just depends. But typically, it's 6 months. For higher end properties, it's a little bit longer. It's usually a year because high end properties tend to take a little bit longer to sell. And then if there's going to be an early termination fee, this typically isn't the case. It's usually just zero in there because no one's going to, this is and this also is a unilateral document, which means that either party can cancel this at any time. A listing agreement doesn't work that way. So this buyer agreement, this is literally this is an employment contract that you have between you and your client. That's what this is. This is really what this is. And so if you were being employed by somebody, you would want to know the hours, what your job was, what your responsibilities were, all those kinds of things. This basically is the same thing. So it's a unilateral document. So you don't want to work with a buyer any longer. You have that right. You have that choice. If the buyer doesn't want to work with you anymore, you have that choice. So early termination fee usually doesn't play. It's usually NA, but that again, that's based on what you want. Purpose of the purpose of the property is, and you can be specific here. You can say a condo in Arlington, single family home in Fairfax County, whatever it might be, but be a little bit specific. Retainer fee. Every once in a while, we see a retainer fee here, and that's usually on the higher end properties, but that typically is NA. Payment, 8B payment. This is where your agents get a little confused about this, and buyers are a little bit funky about this too. So typically, you're going to put in here, since the seller is going to pay the commission for the most part, it's going to be, you will see agents put in here typically 2.5% or per MLS. Okay. And that way, because remember, this is an agreement between you and the client. The client has to pay you. If you were to go to court and you had done everything you were supposed to do, and this client says, I'm not going to pay you now, you would have this document to say, yeah, you're going to pay me. And it's 2.5% or whatever was offered in the MLS. Okay, so that's what's going to go in here. And if there is a admin fee, which we charge in some of our market centers of whatever it might be, I think it's $175. If it's $175, that's where that's also going to be. So if you're going to charge, and you can pay the administration fee, or they can pay it. Most agents have them pay it. So that would look like 2.5% or per MLS plus 175 admin fee. Okay, so you would have all of that out there in front of them. And then it says within X days after expiration of buyer's early termination of agreement, buyers enters into a contract to acquire any real property of type discussed in the purpose paragraph, that you're going to be entitled to that fee. There's a giant caveat to that. And the caveat is right here. It says, unless buyer has entered into a subsequent buyer broker agreement with another real estate broker. Well, if they don't want to work with you anymore, that doesn't mean that they don't want to buy a house. Just means they don't want to work with you anymore. So if they sign with another broker, another agent, you're not going to get anything. So it behooves you to be as good as you can be. Relocation program, yes or no? If it is a relocation program, put in that information that they're asking for, what the program name is, contact information, so forth and so on. Buyer representation. This is a key piece. There's 4 categories. Buyer does not consent to designated representation. Buyer does consent. Buyer does not consent to dual, and buyer does consent to dual representation. Designated representation simply says that as a buyer, you will allow me to show properties that belong to my market center, that belong to my brokerage. And the reason for this was in the old days, an agent would say to a client, because this wasn't there, an agent would say to a client, well, I got a great property. A client might say, I want 3-bedroom, 2-bath in such and such a location. And the agent would say, okay, cool, let's go take a look at it. And then if it didn't work out, they would say, you know something, we have some properties in my brokerage that I can show you as well. And then what happens is the only properties they tend to show them is what's in their brokerage. So designated basically, and there was sort of this issue with people maybe not getting to see all of the properties that were available to them. And designation just basically says, okay, we're not gonna try to pull the wool over your eyes. We're just going to go ahead and have you allow us to show properties that we actually have in our listing portfolio as a market center. And almost all the time, it does consent to designated representation. Dual representation, a tough thing here. My whole thought process is, unless you are have been in business for a long time and it is a transaction that you are literally just the go-between, then you might want to consider doing dual. But in my particular mind, dual representation equals no representation. And does anybody want to tell me what that might look like? If I would explain this to a client, what would I say? What would that look like?
I mean, there's nobody looking out for either party.
That's right. There's no one looking out for either party, but what does that look like? Tell me the story.
I guess it can be like conflict interest of something like that, right? I mean, it can be a little skeptical, both sides, because they might think that you are in that side, the other one might think you're on the other side. So
That's
So
true.
it kind of be like having, going through a divorce and having the same attorney represent both parties.
Yes, that's it. But the story looks like this, just so you understand. And I'll give you another piece too about a kitchen. Don't let me forget about kitchen. Okay, so it looks like this. You're going to do dual representation for these clients. And the client says to you, hey, I really like this property. I want to make an offer on it. What do you think? What's your response?
You can't have a response.
Yeah, I don't know. You think about it. Okay, I got a home inspection.
and
The
that
home
would be
inspection,
in a case where you're representing both. That's the seller and then
yeah.
you
Yep,
have your
that's-
client by. So
that's the-
what would you say?
that's what I tell them. If I'm doing dual, I let them know right off the bat. First of all, there's a disclosure that has to be signed by them, saying that by both parties, by all parties, that everything's been discussed. But if they're thinking about it to begin with, I will tell them, This is what it's going to look like. If you ask me, if we do a home inspection and they ask to have this particular thing fixed, and you say, Jim, what should we ask? I'm going to say to you, I don't know. Because I can't really tell you, right? Because no matter what I say, it's going to seem like I'm favoring somebody, right? And then the other party is going to say, well, you didn't really represent me, you represented them then. So it's very, very difficult. I mean, my answer isn't exactly like that, but it's pretty close. It's like, I will tell them, something, because of the dual representation, there's not much I can literally tell you about what you should be asking for. Typically in the past, I have advised clients to ask for the big infrastructure issues. That's my answer. And they're like, okay, what the heck does that mean? And so that's why it's very, very difficult to explain to some. And that's why I say, tell the story. If you tell the story, they get it. And they'll say, no, no, absolutely, I don't want that. And so I think being honest with them about that, instead of trying to get both sides of the equation of the transaction itself, is just keeps you out of trouble, keeps you licensed. I can't tell you how many times we've had problems with that. It's like I said, dual representation equals no representation. In some states, it's not even allowed. It's frowned upon across a lot of other states simply because of those kind of reasons. And the problem with it is, even if you're really, really savvy, when you start having a conversation with somebody about something, you know that it's going to lead down to different paths. And unfortunately, we, as human nature has it, that we will insert words that literally could be construed as an issue. Yep. What, you got your hand up? What's going on?
Yes, and it goes the same way for rentals, right?
Oh,
Same way
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes, and that's a great example, because right now I have a rental, and this client, obviously these are my clients, and they like this place, a place that we applied for, but we're not sure that we're gonna get that. But I just met another friend that is asking me to do a listing, which is exactly what they're asking for. So it's something that I'm gonna have to probably do.
Yeah, and if you're very clear with them up front and you set the expectation, if we do dual agency, this is what it's going to look like. If you ask me a question about what the lease amount should be, I can't really help you with that. I can tell you generally what rates might be in a specific area, but I can't tell you what to ask for your unit. If there is something in the lease that you want to discuss and it is maybe construed as I'm favoring one party, I can't discuss it. So I think if you're clear with them, that's something that that is really, that can be helpful. When I talk about the kitchen, and I just want to get back with this because it's a story, it comes down to a story. So and this is off topic now, so bear with me. So if I'm on a listing appointment and I'm walking through the house and they just redid their kitchen and it's beautiful. And they say to me, something, well, I'll say, well, when did you have this done? And they'll say, well, we just had it done and it costs $25,000. I think we should be able to get that $25,000 added on to the price. What do you think my answer is?
Something along the lines of, well, let's look at the comparables and see, what they look like and how this compares to those before we can, make a final decision on that.
Yeah, I think you can say that, but I draw an example for them. I give them a picture so that it can quickly understand what I'm talking about in their head, in their heads. So what I will say to them is, something, the kitchen, fabulous job, love the backsplash, love whatever, blah blah blah, and then I'll say, but when the last time you purchased a brand new car and you drove it off the lot, what happened? And they'll say, wow, it depreciated like 10, 20%. I said, the kitchen's no different. The kitchen has depreciated the moment it was finished. It started depreciating. So to say that you want $25,000 for the kitchen is not a realistic situation. In telling them that story, they get it then. They understand that what just happened is really true. Now, there's some things that I can give them and some resources I can provide that will help them understand that a little bit better. But if you can tell a story, that really, really helps. But anyway, back to the buyer agreement. The buyer does not hold an inactive license. I'm sorry about this. My phone's going crazy for some reason. And then any other provisions that you want to put in here. One thing I do want to speak to you about. This is a contract between you and the buyer. And the buyer, when you put into the payment, right here in 8B, okay, it says generally the sellers usually pay, okay, but you're asking the buyer to sign an agreement that says that the buyer will pay the 2.5 or whatever it might be, plus the admin fee. And so what we do see agents that will put in here 2.5 or per MLS paid by seller. Okay, and that allies the fears of a buyer having to pay that amount. Okay, because it is typically paid by seller, or they'll put it down here in comments, in other comments. So the seller will be solely responsible for compensation, the buyer's agent for any transaction that transpires. And they just put that in there, and that way the buyer feels comfortable that they're not going to be on the hook for the money, and the agent gets to sign this document. So it allows the agent to more easily convince the buyer to sign this. But I would highly recommend that you guys do this, that you guys fill this out.
Can I ask you something, Jim?
Sure.
Okay, so when you put there the 2.5%, and let's say the listing is paying 3%, I haven't done a closing, but I'm gonna get there very close. I'm gonna be there soon because I'm working with some buyers.
Good for you.
Thank you. So how would you, let's say I put 2.5%, so how would that process be with the person paying me 3%?
That's why you put in there 2.5 or per MLS,
Oh.
because the MLS is what's telling you how much you're going to get paid, right?
Okay.
So
And do you put it on that blank provisions comment, or where do you
no,
put that?
I put it right here, payment wise, 8B. I actually put it in here. The buyer will pay compensation in the amount of 2.5% or per MLS plus 175 transaction fee. Everything's laid out. Now, if the buyer wants to push back on and say, well, I don't want to pay that. Doesn't the seller pay that? I don't want to sign this if I'm going to be on the hook for that. That's when the buyer's agents will come down here and write in here. Seller will be solely responsible for compensating the broker, the commission amount listed in the MLS. And that way, the seller feels good about it. The agent's going to get paid. Everybody's happy. Everybody moves forward.
And you would do that with every contract, every contract, even rentals. You would specify that in every representation agreement, right?
Yeah, because you don't know what's going to be being paid at the time, right? So sometimes you'll go into the MLS and you'll see that there's a rental in there, and they'll say they're going to pay, 25%. Typically, it's 25%. Okay, the first month's rent. But some people will say, 35%. I'll pay 35%. So that's something that they'll pay 35%. And that's I put in there 0.25% or per MLS if I am representing the tenant.
Okay.
Is it worth tossing in something about for sale by owners, or that just complicates everything?
That's a different thing because for sale by owners, unless you are going to represent the other side, you're representing a buyer. Okay, you're not representing the FSBO itself. Now, if you're going to go look at FSBOs with a buyer agreement, you already have the buyer agreement in place. Now, what happens is you have to start thinking about how you're going to get paid because FSBO's not in the MLS, right? So you have to figure out how you're going to get paid. And one of the things that we have it's called a showing notification, and it's a document that basically says, as a FSBO, I will pay the buyer, the buyer's broker X amount of money if they bring a buyer to the property and they sell. So, and a couple of things on FSBOs. There's if you've seen I don't know if you've seen this or not, have you all seen the latest version of the buyer and seller guide for 2022 that NAR puts out? You should really get it.
No,
Okay, you should really get it. And what it basically does is it tells you, they do a survey. National Association of Realtors does a survey every single year. And it is, it's got everything you could possibly imagine in there in regards to factors surrounding buyers, their habits, their ages, their demographics, everything. How they search for an agent, how long they search for an agent, same with sellers and everything else. And one of the things they do cover is FSBOs. And FSBOs has a very poor record. It's like 9% of all properties sold in the United States, or 8 or 9%, 8 or 9% that are sold in the United States are by FSBO. But 5% of that, the FSBO, the owner already knows the person who's going to buy it. So it's not FSBOs aren't as good as what they think. And the difference between what an agent would get for that same property, there's about a $50,000 or $60,000 delta. An agent's going to get, $60,000, $60,000 more than somebody selling it on their own completely. So yeah.
question is, so what usually is the percentage, the commission for the buyer agent that gets a FSBO?
That's negotiable because it's not set in the MLS. So, you're going to talk to the FSBO owner and say, hey, listen,
Whatever they decide, whatever you agree with.
Whatever you guys agree with. Absolutely.
There's not an overpay or underpay, right?
No, that's
Okay.
usually it. I've always recommended that you try to stay within that 2 to 2.5%, 3% range.
Okay.
So it's, because that's reasonable, because you're going to still have to do the work, and that's what you would charge, and that's what you would get paid if it was in the MLS. So, but sometimes, I've seen them go for for 1.5%, 1.75%. Just so that, their client gets what they want and they get some money out of it. So that's the buyer's agreement itself. I think, I'm not sure we're going to have enough time to go over a listing agreement. Is there anything else you guys would like to discuss today? Questions?
I would like to know if you're able to email one whole sample of the Virginia contract fill out for us that haven't done it.
I've done that in the past. Yeah, I can do that.
Well, thank you so much.
What, one question, another question?
Sure.
Okay, I'm not clear about if you're, let's say material defects or whatever, if there's or here's the example. So if you're a listing agent and you know that across the street, there's going to be a garbage dump built, it's not there now. Is that something that you need to disclose? And I
No,
guess the same thing's true with a buyer, if you're a buyer agent. It's not part of it's not part of the property itself, but it's across the street, and it would have an effect on most people's thinking about buying or not buying.
that's right, but it's not a material defect. Because it's not contained within the four corners of the property itself. Now, is it something that you should be aware of and you would discuss with your client? Absolutely. But do you have to, as a seller, have to disclose that? No, you don't.
What if
That's-
what if you're the buyer agent?
If you're the buyer's agent and you know that, you're going to advise your client of that. Yes, you would
Do you
do that.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, but as far as the definition of a material defect, it is not simply because it doesn't affect the four corners of the property itself. And so all of those other extraneous decisions, extraneous factors that may go into the decision-making process, that's something as a buyer's agent, you should really pay attention to. And you should be informing your client of that, because the client's going to ask, you know what's going across the street? Yeah, I do know what's going across the street. Or you might even be forthright about it and say, you know, something that's a great looking property and everything, but you know, right now on the drawing board is for it to have a metro garage go across the street or whatever. That's a factor that is important, because if you don't disclose that and
Well, yeah.
and then down the line, you know what's going to happen, right? There's going to be problems. But a seller has no obligation to disclose that.
What about airplane noise overhead, which is a problem in Arlington?
There is, and
Seller.
there's actually a DPOR form that talks to aircraft and aircraft noise. So there's a bunch of different DPOR forms. And when I say DPOR forms, I am talking about residential sales, the residential property disclosure. And there's one for airports, one for meth lab, one for environmental easements. There's a bunch of them in there. And if you are near any of those or aware of those, and as a buyer's agent, you need to investigate the areas around it. You will provide the appropriate documentation if it calls for it. But yeah, that is a problem. Airports can be a problem.
What about as a listing agent, and you know there's noise coming overhead, et cetera? Is it?
Yeah, that's not going to be a material defect, but it
Okay.
should be disclosed if somebody asks you. Again,
Oh,
not
okay.
within the four corners, but if somebody says, you know, something do you hear noise when planes go over? Yes, you know, we do have, you know, there is noise when the airline, when planes are landing and taking off from the airport. And at that point in time, it's their decision. Because if you don't make that disclosure, that can be a problem for you down the line. You knew about it as an agent. It may not fall upon the shoulders of the seller, but it will certainly fall upon your shoulders. Make sense?
Well, sorry to beat that horse, but I had a listing like that one. So is a listing agent required to disclose that to people,
No.
or only if they're asked, hey, I see there's an airport down here. Did the planes fly over here? You go,
That's right.
yes.
Yeah, and they have to answer truthfully. So the thing about it is, as a buyer's agent, you are the one that's doing the sort of investigative work behind that particular property, that particular neighborhood, and any of the environments that may impact it. And so that's just part of what you should be doing. You know, we have what we call marine clay here in parts of in Alexandria. I'm sure it's throughout, but it's prevalent in Alexandria down the Parkway, GW Parkway, where there is marine clay is part of the actual ground, the foundational ground of the properties, and it shifts. And it can cause some serious property structure damage. And so that needs to be disclosed. And that is a material defect. And why is that a material defect, but airplanes aren't?
Well, but airplane, the space above your property is part of what you're buying, isn't it?
It is, but it's not within the four corners of the property itself. You're buying straight up. You're right. You're buying straight up. And but it's not a latent defect or material defect, only has to do within the four corners. But you're absolutely right. When you buy something, you're buying straight up into the air as well. But the reason why marine clay is a material defect is because it affects the four corners of that property.
You know, the
Okay.
foundation could crack. You know?
That's right. That's exactly right. You got it. So that's exactly why that is a material defect. Just like methamphetamine is a material defect unless it's been remediated. But airplane noise isn't really, it isn't a material defect. Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Okay.
Do you teach DMB in general? Are you DMB licensed? Do you teach contract DMB or just Virginia?
No, I am. I should have introduced myself to begin with.
I got here late, so.
That's okay. No, I am the lead broker for all of the market centers. Our
Okay.
4 market centers. All of the brokers report to me. I am the director of luxury, the director of marketing. I handle the websites. I handle all of that. So I don't do a lot of training anymore. But I do train. I'm licensed. I'm a broker in both DC and in Virginia. No plans to be a broker in Maryland. I don't.
Why is that?
It's painful.
Okay.
Maryland's very difficult.
Okay.
I mean, their contracts and the documents they require are just too much. And besides,
I'm starting to take that. I mean, to pass the license, I took it the first time, but I failed. So
what, the Maryland license?
yes, I'm licensed in DC and Virginia.
Yeah, it's just for me, it was just a pain. And I never sold property in Maryland, so I didn't get it. I didn't want it. I didn't want to have to deal with Maryland. So, but I'm very well versed in Maryland simply because I oversee all of the brokers and we have a lot of Maryland brokers. So, it's one thing that I'm involved in, but, so I don't teach a lot, but, we are in discussions about, training a little bit more on, the listing agreement and the buyer's agreement and the addendums and the contract itself. So we're going to break it down into pieces. And so you're not getting 2 and 3 hours of training, and we kind of lose you halfway through or 2/3 of the way through. So
I think it's great. This is very helpful for me because I haven't really done a complete closing. Like I haven't gotten there yet, and I get very nervous when I was doing just my rental right now that I did the whole situation with the representation agreement. So, and I was thinking, that's why I was asking you if you were doing this. I was checking on the calendar. I didn't see any for this month. But are you able to share your contacts in case that I have a question or no?
Sure.
Okay, I put my email there in my my email and my phone number. I put it there. But if you share it, that would be very nice because sometimes, as a new agent, you're trying to reach out and then you don't, people get busy. So you probably get somebody.
Yeah. What office are you out of?
Arlington?
Arlington?
Yes.
Okay. So, and who's your broker? What's your last name? What's your last name?
My last name is Santos. So I think my broker is Jonathan or Rick. I mean, they both, I think they're doing it.
Yeah, Jonathan Jonathan's going to be yours no matter what, because he does Virginia from M to Z, last name M to Z initial, and he does the Maryland and DC agents as well. And Rick does teams. So Rick
Yes.
won't be your broker, But I'll give you my phone number if you'd like. I'll just give it to you now.
I really appreciate it. It's hard
Okay.
to reach out sometimes and they're very busy, so it's,
Yep.
for me, it's been hard.
Okay, so
Thank you
I'm
so
just
much.
gonna say it, 703
Okay,
867
867
5090.
5090, it's 202,
703,
okay,
Eight-
73.
yeah, 703-867-5090, and my email is jim@kwmetrocenter.com. Pretty simple.
Okay, Jim with JY.
No, JIM, Jim
AIM.
at kwmetrocenter.com.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay. Okay, well, if that's it, folks, if there's no other questions or anything I can answer for you, I'll just finish up by saying, you know, and we started off, I was saying that you're going to do most of your business with buyers this year. And typically, you know, some people start off by doing rentals, which is a great way to get your feet wet and start understanding how the mechanics of things work. So if that's something you can do, if you're able to do it, great. I think it's a great starting point, but know that the bigger money and where you would be able to, you know, sustain a career would be, you know, handling buyers initially, and then going after the listing agreements once you become comfortable with that. And so along those lines, I would tell you about, you know, is anybody here in the PC program? The productivity coaching program in your market centers?
Yes.
Okay. Prior to the PC program, the forerunner of that program was the mentorship program. And that was more of a one-on-one sort of mentoring program that we would take agents through everything contract wise, listing agreements. We'd go out on listing appointments with them and everything else like that. That program, the mentoring program, was actually written by me, and I was the head mentor at that point in time. And so one of the things that always concerned agents, newer agents, or the more inexperienced agents, I should say, is when I would ask them what their greatest fear was, their fear was literally, I don't want to come across stupid. I don't want to give the wrong answer. I'm not comfortable talking about my experience levels when a client asks me about those things. And, you know, that was generally the overall feedback we received. I don't think that's changed. I think that's still the same today. I think new agents they don't understand the contractual documents well enough. So that doesn't portend any kind of confidence for them. They don't want to make any mistakes, so they're hesitant to speak about things, and they don't want to come across like they really don't know. And so there's a few factors going that are there that causes them some hesitancy. And what I would tell them at that point in time, and what I would tell you today, is that the only way, knowledge trumps experience, period. Knowledge trumps experience. And what I simply mean by that is, if you know everything there is to know about a certain subject, you're comfortable, you're confident, you come across that way, you express yourself that way. And so if you're going to represent buyers, if that's going to be your business initially, and hopefully you get listing agreements, love if you get that. But initially, if you're doing buyers, what I would suggest to you is to know everything there is to know about buyers. And what I mean by that is, have you gone onto the internet and looked up conventional loans and FHA loans and VA loans, and have you talked to title people, and have you looked at magazines and articles? Know everything there is to know that would allow you to feel comfortable speaking in a room to a client. And if you do that, you will find that the experience factor sort of melts away. And because the way you present yourself and the knowledge that you're able to impart to them starts to make you more of an expert, builds your confidence, builds their confidence in you, and the more likely you are to get, to get buyers to, to consult with you. And I'll tell you, and maybe you've heard this from me before, because I do bring this up when I'm talking about buyers. If you were to have a consultation with a buyer, let's say that I'm a buyer, and I call you up and I say, I'd love to sit down with you and talk about buying a home. And your response is what?
Sounds great. When can we get together and
Okay.
talk about what your questions are? So,
Okay, great. So I say, terrific. And you're going to say, well, what I'd like to do is I'd like to get some preliminary information from you. Okay, where you're living right now, what kind of, what's your timeline, that kind of stuff. And I'd like you to come into the office and sit down so I can, properly consult with you on your buyer needs. You want to get them into a space. Now, it could be a coffee shop, could be their home, but you want to get into a space where you're not just talking on the phone, you're face to face, you can have a conversation with them. So now I'm in the room with you. And this gentleman, what's your name? You're the only guy on the phone besides me.
who, me? Kevin?
Yeah, Kevin.
Sorry.
Okay, so Kevin, I'm in the room and you're in the room, and I say, I'm going to pick on you. Okay, just so you know. Okay.
It's
So
okay.
I say to you, it's nice to meet you. What's the next step? What's your response?
Well, the first thing, I'm sorry, are we in the meeting face to face now?
Yep, we are.
Okay, well, there's a couple of things we need to go over. The first is, have you picked a lender yet?
No, I haven't.
Okay, because there's a couple of key things we need to do. One is to go over get you pre-approved to find out what you can really, afford. And I mean, better words, you kind of caught me off guard here. So we
That's
need to talk to a lender, and then we need to talk about, what kind of home you're looking for. And I have here a buyer's guide. So I'm going to provide that with you right now, and you can look through that to get, more details about the process and what's involved. It's not just finding a home you like and then saying I want it and then paying for it. There's potentially other steps such as home inspections, et cetera. So we'll get you educated and up to speed on all of those things. So that's a key aspect of the process. And once we get you up to speed on that and find out what you're pre-approved for and the kind of property you're looking for and areas you're looking for, then we can start putting together a plan of the different types of properties that are available for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You have any
Not bad for a first time out.
You kind of caught me off guard there, but
Yeah, that's fine. I look at it totally different.
oh well, okay.
I qualify the buyer first.
Oh, okay.
Okay, you may have heard me talk about this, and I qualify them by, I'll start off with a little bit of small talk with them, because I, found out a little bit about them on the phone initially. And I'll say to them, where do most buyers come from?
Open houses, I guess. Or...
No, I mean, but where are they starting? They may come from an open house, but where are they starting from?
Like Zillow or something? Or...
On the
No,
internet.
what they're currently doing is they're renting. That's what I mean.
Renting.
Most buyers are renting, unless they're move-up buyers, right? For the most part. And that might not be somebody that you're in touch with. And if it is, terrific. Then you're going to go home and talk to them. But most of them are renters. So after the small talk chat with them, I'll basically say to them, so I'm going to assume that you're currently renting. Is that correct? That's correct. And if I may ask, what do you pay in rent per month now? And they'll say, well, we got a 2-bedroom, it's $3,000. Boom. I automatically know that they can afford a $3,000 mortgage payment, right? So now it narrows down my price point a little bit as to what they can actually afford. I don't need a lender to tell me that initially, okay? Because they just told me what they can afford for the most part. Can they go up a little bit? Probably, okay, but it's still within that range. And then I'll say to them, well, what do you know about the process? How far along in the process are you? And you know, what have you done so far? And they'll say something like, well, we've been searching on the internet, and you know, we've seen a couple of nice homes. We've, you know, we preliminarily have talked to a lender, but we haven't done anything ironclad yet. And we know that we have to put money down, and it's like usually 20% or something like that. And first of all, that's wrong. 20% down is wrong. But anyway, and I'll say, okay, so has anybody ever told you what it costs to get into a house? And they'll say, well, you know, well, outside of the down payment, no. Well, I'll say, well, let me break this down for you so you understand what the cost of actually getting into a house means. So I'll say, first of all, you have to have a minimum of 3%. And I'll say, let's just take an example of $500,000 because it's easy. And I'll say, okay, so on a $500,000 home, you will need a minimum of 3% down. That's $15,000. You have closing costs, and it's usually closer to 2.5 than 2, but about 2%. Okay, so that's $10,000. That's $25,000. Okay, you have an earnest money deposit of 1% usually, which is $5,000. So now you're at $30,000, and then you have $1,000 for out-of-pocket expense, which is home inspection, appraisal, pest inspection, and that's money you're not going to get back. It's sort of like going to a nightclub. When you go to a nightclub and you have to pay to get in, you pay your money, you get in, and that's it. You don't get it back. This is the same thing. So right now we're at $31,000. Somebody want to say something?
Yes, I want to say something. You say, can you repeat that? It's about 3%, and then you say closing.
It's a minimum of 3% down. Okay,
Or-
on
that's
a
for the down
conventional
payment.
loan
Yes, for the down payment, right?
for the down payment.
And
Closing
then the
costs, closing costs are going to be about, I'm gonna say for our purposes here today, 2%. They're typically closer to 2.5. So, and then there's 1% for the earnest money, earnest money, and then there's about $1,000 out of pocket that they don't get back. So that comes down to $31,000 roughly. And the $500,000 is a good starting point, because that's typically in Arlington and Alexandria, for the most part, outside of condos, that's typically right around the price range that they're going to have for a single family home or
for the closing, you say it's about 5,000. You say 2% or 2.5%, or what?
I said for our purposes today, I'm going to say 2%, but it's
Okay.
typically about 2.5%.
2.5%
2.5%.
of the whole loan.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yep. Closing costs about 2.5%. So they'll say, I'll say that's $31,000. I'll say, do you have $31,000 in funds available? And they'll say either yes or no. If they say yes, terrific. If they say no, then I'll say, then I automatically in my mind know that they may need to get a subsidy. They may need to get a seller subsidy in order to make this happen. That also tells me, and then I'll say, tell me what do you know what your credit score is, and what your credit history look like? And I'll say, well, we have good credit score 7 something, whatever it might be. Okay, I actually kind of know what kind of loan they're going to be able to get at that point in time, because I know that the different types of loan are going to require different things to be able to qualify. Conventional loan, I can get it for 3% down as a low. That's the lowest I can go. The debt to income, the credit score has got to be above 700 The debt to income's got to be around 43% max. They don't like to go more than that. And then if they say, well, you know, my credit's not that great, but I've been repairing it, it's actually pretty good. It's about 640 right now. Well, I know FHA is going to be something that they'll be able to qualify, because I think their number is 620, and they'll even go down lower than that. So before I even ask them anything about the house that they want, I've qualified them. I know literally what they can afford, how much their payment can be. And then we can talk about properties. Then I'll sit back and say, okay, so now tell me a little bit about the kind of property you would like to purchase. And now they'll say, okay, you know, I'd like to have a condo. I'd like to buy a single family home down in this area, whatever it might be. The other thing I would recommend, like outside of understanding everything you possibly can about what a buyer would need or want, or information about that, you would also have to know about first-time home buyer programs, incentives, those kinds of things. Really dig in. The other thing I did when I first came to Virginia was I took an hour every single day and I drove neighborhoods. I drove every street in the neighborhood, and I would do 2 neighborhoods maybe a day, and I would just kept doing that. And the reason why I did that was because I wanted to understand the neighborhoods themselves. So there's been times that I've been in a buyer consultation, and I'll say, after I get through the whole thing of trying to qualify them, I'll say, so now where do you want to live? And they'll say, well, we love living down the Parkway. You know, we'd like to live in the Waynewood School District, or we'd like to live in the Stratford Lakes, you know, school district. And, you know, we'd really prefer a condo. Well, that you can't live in those school districts. And they'll say, why? It's because they don't have condos. There's no condos available. It's all single family. Okay. Or they'll say, you know something, we want a single family home and we love Villa May, or I'm trying to think of the other one off the top of my head, Marlin Forest. We love that area. And I'll say, I love that area too. Great. Older homes, big lots, half-acre lots. The homes have been updated for the most part. The problem is there's no sidewalks. So if you have a dog or children and you want to walk in the evening or in the daytime, realize that there's no sidewalks. So, and they'll say, well, how do you know that? I simply drove the neighborhoods. So I've done all of the legwork ahead of time to be able to impart that knowledge. So dig in and learn everything you can about a buyer. You know, there is so much information out there that's available to you that will really make you stand out and really make you feel comfortable, and will go a long way towards your experience levels. That would be the biggest, the best advice I could give to people coming in, and or in the more inexperienced agents. I think that's really that's the key to moving forward. So I told you I was gonna leave you with that. That was about 15 minutes ago. So I am gonna leave you with it. Any last questions that I can answer for you? NAR, National Association of Realtors, you have a subscription to it. Get on that site, look at their resources, look at their reports. Absolutely great information. Okay. Look at cost versus value 2022. The magazine that gives you a breakdown of all of the remodel costs in a particular area. We're in the South Atlantic area. You have to download it. They don't give you, they don't send you emails or junk, but it really gives you a great idea of what a remodeled high-end kitchen would go for, return on investment. If I spent $100,000, what could I expect to get? It's about 63%. It's about 63 cents on the dollar. Okay, so when I say you drive it off the lot and it depreciates immediately, and they now see this report, wow, am I a genius or am I a genius? So there's a lot of resources out there, folks. So spend some time on it, and I think you'll be extremely successful. Thanks for spending some time with me today. And if I can ever answer any questions, please let me know and I'll be happy to help you.
Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
You guys have a great evening.